our culture presents a lot of early domestic abuse signs as like protection, flirting, cutesy. So, I mean, that's what we're contending with, that we have romanticized abuse. What I never see enough of is, why do men believe that a successful TikToker should be killed? Why do men believe that if their sister marries of her own choice, she must die? In fact, on my video about Sana Yousaf, which to date is my most watched video, I had a comment that said, "Don't worry, babe, you're next." I think, when we talk about misogyny, and I'll bluntly say that people hate women, people want to fight with me on that because it just sounds so extreme. What we're always asking is, why aren't you all doing more to mitigate the violence of men? But what I'm not seeing more of is, why did he do it? But I still think that none of this work can start until we call it what it is, which is, this is femicide.
In the past few weeks, we've seen multiple cases of femicide emerge and narratives around it, social media unravel. What we've seen also are cases where online hates is basically following women home. And in these cases, a very important question arises, that apart from the overall patriarchy that enables these murders of innocent women in their homes, outside their homes, wherever they're, very brutally and tragically killed. At what point does online misogyny stop being just speech and become part of the infrastructure that enables violence against women? So we've seen how, there've been a lot of comment sections, there've been a lot of posts, and there's been this very jarring misogyny coming about. But this isn't just restricted to before murders. We've seen in a lot of cases narratives being formed around content creators, around other women, which has often led to their murder. We had the case of Qandeel Baloch almost 10 years ago, in which her brother took away her life because of her online activity and content creation. And recently, we've seen the Ayesha Gilaman case, in which a young woman was again killed by her own family for her online activity. But other than that, we also saw the Sana Yousaf case, in which her life was taken away. She was brutally killed inside her home by a man who she had rejected. And of course, other than this, we've seen the cases of Noor, Mukadam, and very recently of Hina Javed, two women who were killed inside the home, essentially by very brutal methods. And after their murders, we've seen strange comments and narratives which tend to blame the victim rather than, focus on the perpetrator of the crime, the murderers who ruthlessly take away these lives. So to talk about, how online narratives form around women, how misogyny influences such acts, and how these signs should be taken, we're joined by Sabah Bano Malik today. She's a content creator, a journalist, and also an activist. She is an authority on women's rights, especially online. So thank you very much for joining us, Sabah. And tragically, Sabah is also related to Hina Javed, whose case has been, just came to light last week, in which she tragically was murdered inside her home by her husband. So, Sabah, just to start with, maybe you can talk to us a bit about how you see online narratives around women broadly, and what you think the impact of that is on women's safety.
Well, first, thanks for having me. You mean the online narrative around women in general?
Yes.
Well, in general, I think that we fall into two categories for our commenters, particularly. It's like, either you are an object that of desire or you are an object of mire, not to make a rhyme, but it's either you're desired in a way that is very specific or you are abhorred in equal notions. And by the way, that can come from the same person towards the same creator. If I go a little bit more specific, content creators like, the ones who have been victims of crimes, or even like myself, other journalists who are women, the type of vitriol we get on the internet has quite literally led to studies around the world because it is so abusive, it is so violent, and it's like when you start a forest fire, essentially. One person sets it off and everyone wants to take away with it. I think in general, our attitudes towards women, particularly in Pakistan, is should be not seen nor not heard. So when you're online and you're doing both, you're kind of already breaking what some people believe to be a rule or a defining characteristic of what makes a good woman. And that'll get people, of course, riled up. And there is no one perhaps more confident than an anonymous account on the internet that has full access to comment wherever they'd like.
Right. And then I'd also like to talk to you about, the distinction between direct digital escalation, like we see cases of stalking, of threats, of doxing, of location tracking, and then the broader online culture that legitimizes violence, right? So on one hand, you have very targeted actions, targeting women journalists, women activists, content creators. And on the other hand, you have all these comment sections essentially that are legitimizing violence. So do you see one as complementing the other, or how do you see this entire ecosystem that is targeting women?
I mean, it feels like it's built into the system of these platforms that we use. Quite recently, I wish I could quote you the exact handle, but I'll get it for you. On TikTok, there was a viral video where this woman said, okay, we need to talk about regulations on TikTok. You probably know what I'm talking about. Is she searched men are the problem. And this was flagged as abusive content and bullying content. And therefore, it wouldn't even show her videos that are related to that. Then she searched women are the problem. As you can imagine, inundated with videos, I mean, of all spectrums and sizes. And I only bring that up to say is that the ecosystem of social media has now more and more become, and I think we've seen a correlation between the more right slinging of our governments, of our countries, of our policies. And I don't just mean Pakistan, but worldwide. And this culture of just hating women loudly and proudly. And when comments that are literal death threats, rape threats, assault threats, like you mentioned, doxing, location tracking, we have to prove that that is somehow malicious or somehow something that needs to be reported and needs to be handled by moderators of these applications and these platforms. However, if I write, for example, like all men, that can get flagged simply by the algorithm and what they have in place. So I think, sorry, I kind of missed the first part of your question. I hope I'm answering it when I say this, but I think in general, when you already have a culture which is so used to policing women and seeing women's behavior and actions as somehow something for all of us to solve and all of us to control. And then you add social media platforms that are like, have at. You are up to me. There's nothing, it's literally like gasoline on a grill, essentially, and like making the fires bigger.
Right. We've also seen a lot of these, murder cases being described simply as TikTok murder or
Yeah.
TikToker or influencer being killed, right? Rather than looking at it in the larger ecosystem of femicide that we're experiencing. How do you see that sort of impacting how these cases are perceived? Right? Because so essentially, this question is about how people look at just online misogyny, and then sort of keep it separate from the overall patriarchal violence that exists around us.
Well, I'm so glad that you said this because I think it's such a tool of the system at work to be like TikToker. As someone who's been a journalist for many years, unfortunately, I know what's being done there. It's a headline which is meant to be inflammatory by telling you, hey, gauge how bad you feel for this person because you might hesitate to feel bad for this deviant woman who's doing this thing that we believe bad women do. Influencer, TikToker, I get that off the top, you mentioned maybe the most famous case out of Pakistan, which was Qandeel Baloch. Unfortunately, now we have Sana Yousaf Ayesha. Can you pronounce her last name for me again? I keep saying Ayesha from Taxila, but obviously it's her full name.
Gilamana.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ayesha Gilamana.
Yeah, I think her case in particular has been her murder, has been maybe the most egregious example of this that we have, as it was only a week ago, a few days ago, in which people were choosing to run that as the headline. 1.3 million followers. Before you learn anything else about her, you learn that this woman had influence on the internet. And therefore, before you read the rest of the story, we know we've biased your opinion against her. Listen, I'm a member of the media and I believe in true journalism. Obviously, here we are. We're here on Dawn. I'm also a member of the Dawn family myself. But I will say that clicks, views, links, things like this, they do matter. And they matter in what modern media is. And so when you have a rage baiting title like that, they absolutely know what they're doing, and when you went into the comments, yes, people were celebrating it. And when Sana Yousaf was killed, people were also saying that, like, good. I hope this is the start of something more. In fact, on my video about Sana Yousaf, which to date is my most watched video, I had a comment that said, "Don't worry, babe, you're next."
Wow.
So there is this, I talk about, sorry, you asked me to separate this from our general culture, so I won't go back into that. Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
absolutely. And you spoke a bit about how platforms are essentially amplifying misogyny, right? And you put it really well, where you said if you compare speech criticizing men in general versus speech criticizing women, there's a huge disbalance, right?
Yeah.
And you also spoke about how engagement farming is essentially done, where uh, probably the platforms are thinking, okay, misogyny is popular, is gaining a lot of engagement. So perhaps, let this fire burn so that we can make more profit, right?
Yeah.
But what we're also seeing is this entire like ecosystem of humor. So there'll be repeated jokes and slurs and calls to discipline women, which is essentially, misogyny, but it's packaged as entertainment. And then that is increasingly, used to make such views socially acceptable. Um, do you see the same when women talk about men?
No. Yes, jokes here and there are made, but I would remind people that in tragedy, people tend to make jokes, and in trauma, people tend to make jokes. But this is actually something that's been pointed out this week about Hina Javed's case. Yes, she is my cousin, but I'm going to refer to her as Hina Javed, full name for this conversation, just to keep the name out there. Is that more and more? It's always women, predominantly the people sharing, commenting, expressing grief are women, and they will inundate. And I'll also tell you that when men come online and talk about the harm they've faced and the way the patriarchy has impacted them, women are usually the ones flooding their comments, supporting them as well. You don't, when I've made videos about men I've made dating content, I've made Bumble content, Rishta, Shadi, I've covered the gambit. And yes, I've made jokes. And yes, I've fried people or I've made fun of bad comments that I've gotten from men and stuff. But the comments are never about the celebration of murder, the celebration of
Mm,
femicide, the celebration. You used a really good word there, which was discipline. The idea that as a collective male, like population, we have the power to discipline these women and keep them in line. Actually, this is why I often say that like all men benefit from the violence of some men, because if we're going to behave in order to stay alive, then they don't really have to raise their hand anymore. So no, you don't see women doing it in comments really at all. I mean, I would say it would be an outlier. And frankly, the way that we report on stuff like this, I imagine that if women were celebrating the, rape and murder of a man, it would probably make headlines because it would be so outlandish for us to try to stomach.
And, I want to go a bit into this whole how signs of misogyny can often how they should be taken, right? So we saw in the case of Hina Javed how her basically the man who killed her was on social media. There's videos of him where he's talking about a man killing his wife,
Yeah.
basically. And then we've seen a lot of content coming out where there's comments that he's made on social media that are quite jarring, quite misogynistic. Um, but we don't see enough action taken against such content online from a platform level. We don't see any laws that help you report such content as dangerous content. And we also don't see any societal consequences for men who are issuing these statements, these threats, these signs, essentially exposing themselves loud and clear and in public. But we're not seeing the reaction to it taking that seriously, right?
Yeah.
So in that context, how do you think they should be dealt with if there is someone on the internet expressing these views, including about murders and deaths? Um, how should this be treated? A, by the platform, B, by society, and C, also by the legal system.
So A, by platform, I mean, I don't know if you've tried to report anything on Meta or Twitter X in the last few years, but like they are literally like, oh, this person listed your house address. That seems to be a personal problem. There's nothing we can do about it. So yes, the platforms, I think A and C kind of come together where it's C needs to start holding A accountable. Because without holding these platforms accountable for what they're allowing to spread under the guise of free speech, and I know this is a slippery slope, but I think there's a huge difference between me saying I align here politically and someone saying I think we should drag all TikTokers out into the streets and do the same to them. And the fact that platforms want to be finicky about what the difference between those two things are, all while like not paying taxes. Somehow they have no problem getting finicky when it comes to where they should be held accountable. I think that is where laws have to step in. Because if you are fostering a hate environment, why is it different than if a bunch of like KKK people are some, in like a cabin together making plans? It's really no difference. I think also where ANC, for those who may have missed the question, where like these platforms and where government and lawmaking has to join forces, is understanding that although women might make up nearly or more than 50% of a population, we are still a marginalized group in the sense that we are a group that faces systemic and cultural violence based on our gender. If you don't see that as a real issue and you don't acknowledge it as a real issue, then your laws aren't going to reflect it. And now, sorry, I might get a little long in this one, but when your lawmakers and your judiciary and your lawyers and your activists, in some cases, even kind of meh when it comes to women's rights violations or things like that, or they themselves express where their patriarchal and biased opinions come from. We can look in the Noor Mukadam case. I mean, over and over again, people that we expected better from were expressing their biases against the victim of a crime. So it's like, okay, well, if the people we trust to regulate are also operating from this level of bias, we have a big fight between us and them, because the platforms, they're going to be like, well, y'all don't even care. So why do we have to care? And like you said earlier, it's critical to remember that they make money when we are flooding their platforms with our comments, with our likes, with our shares, with our content. So when the red pill incel side of things is really flourishing, why would they be like, you know what would be great? Losing money today by protecting
Mm.
the other part of the internet. Sorry, for B, you said, what is it that we could be doing?
Yeah, as a society, right?
I mean, as a society, I'll tell you, I was asked a question yesterday, which was, do you think the university should be held accountable for hiring a professor and allowing this kind of speech to happen? And unfortunately, in Pakistan, misogyny starts from like day one. So, the girl uniform in school, very different to the boys' uniform. Girls wearing Western clothes is already deemed as something they
Mm.
shouldn't be doing. The boys' school uniform is not a shalwar kameez and a koti, and that is on purpose. They get to continue playing sports. They are not, I mean, the policing. I attended a private school in Lahore in seventh and eighth grade. So I have experienced the mistake of a bra strap slipping out and being admonished like you are the worst thing on earth. So when our culture is so anti-women and people want to believe it's not, because maa ke pyar mein, jannat chalti hai and all these things, and we like to pretend that we hold women in high regard, but the reality is, as long as they are controlled, we hold them in high regard, but when they go out of that, we don't. So societally, we have a lot of work to do, unfortunately. And but I still think that none of this work can start until we call it what it is, which is, this is femicide. This isn't honor killings. This isn't, cultural, which they love to paint various parts of Pakistan as if it's like barbarians, when in reality, I don't care your social class, social background, ethnicity, language, it's happening
Mm.
everywhere. So I think without declaring it that, and without declaring a crisis, all three of these things can't work together. But A is probably the most insidious in terms of online, because nobody holds them accountable and they just kind of dance around it.
Mm. Mm. Mm.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. I also want to now come to, the trial after these murders happen. And of course, it's a very grueling process for the family and friends of the victim. But what we see is, there's all these online responses to the murder. We've seen in the case of, Faisal Asghar Imam and Zahir Jaffer, how so many men will, and others, even women will come out to sort of protect them, right? In the narratives that we see. But of course, we see a lot of solidarity as well. And then when the investigation is happening, you see the media jumping in, you see all sides jumping in to pitch in. And it essentially becomes something about, okay, it's a trending topic. So everyone needs to have an opinion on it. And, every commentator has to have a vlog on it, a show on it, which is fine. But then the kind of stuff that comes out sometimes could also, damage or influence the investigations and other um, uh, uh, parts of the entire case. So we're seeing that public attention is important, but what is the downside of this public attention that you see or have experienced, in these cases?
Well, I'll personalize this one a little bit, because obviously it is Hina Javed. But what I've been warning my family is that when women die in Pakistan, there is a tendency to blame the family, to blame her, to blame porn, to blame this, to blame that, especially anything but the perpetrator of the crime. And though people will say, like, this man murdered her, month, like they'll say it, but they will always be a caveat. Like the way I spoke with, 9 journalists yesterday from 9 different news stations at 9 different times, and each one asked the question, were there any signs? Were there any signs? And listen, this question can be asked in good faith, and I understand this question from a curiosity point of view, but I would challenge people to ask, why are you asking that question? And I think it's because on one hand, people want to think of themselves in a hero role, that they would have spotted it in this. But on the other hand, it's that, what could you, the victim and the victim's family, have done differently? What did you do wrong? That is essentially what happens. And now, people will tear your family apart. They'll say, well, one question actually right now, I had just been somewhere and someone recognized me and said, well, why did she even get married? And this has also happened online, but being asked directly to my face, I was like, it feels disingenuous of a question, because as Pakistanis, shadi is a huge part of our culture. That question felt very annoying to me, for lack of a better word, but I have seen it everywhere. Independent career woman, why did she get married? Why didn't her family do more? Da 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 da. Listen, I have seen these cases and I have asked these questions myself as well. But what I'm not seeing more of is, why did he do it? What I never see enough of is, why do men believe that a successful TikToker should be killed? Why do men believe that if their sister marries of her own choice, she must die? These questions we are never asking. What we're always asking is, why aren't you all doing more to mitigate the violence of men? And that is such a big part of this online discourse that ends up happening. Like, I would say those type of questions, why didn't you predict the bad man was a bad man, are always more in volume than the, why are these men doing bad things? And why aren't we solving that problem? And it's impossible to have this conversation without the most common comment that we get when stuff like this happens, which is, come on, not all men, not all men, not all men. So even when we're talking about the destruction of a family by murder, because that family will never be the same again, even then, we are looking out for the comfort of men just reading posts over anything else. Like, we are almost always in a state of protecting men's feelings from their own behavior and their things. I hope I'm answering your question. Sorry, this is a topic I'm very passionate about, so I tend to go.
No, absolutely. And
Yeah.
what you're saying is also making me think, how many people are asking questions about the murderer, right? Like
Yeah.
you rightly pointed out. So are there people asking, okay, why did his family raise him to be a murderer? Why did his father try to cover up the murder, right? Why did so many people not point out that what the kind of person that he was,
Yes.
so all of these narratives come out, but there's very little focus on that. And again,
Mm.
there's this huge barrage of like victim blaming again and again, as if the family is to blame for essentially losing a member of their family, rather than the perpetrator and the ecosystem that operates over there. Because no one wants their relative, to go through this. So
Yeah.
it's almost as if, it's so obvious, but yet so jarring that these sort of narratives, do come up.
Yeah,
We've
and
also,
sorry not to go too long on this, but when they do question the raising of the man, who are they questioning? Mom. It's always
hmm,
mom. If I sisters, it's the male responsibility and accountability for us does not exist. It
hmm,
truly doesn't. Like, it's always the mother messed up. Even today, I was told, who's to blame? The mother. I'll
hmm,
just point out, in Hina Javed's case, the mother of the murderer is a bedridden Alzheimer's patient. And like you rightfully pointed out, it was the father that jumped into action to help do a cover up. So questions need to be directed the right way.
Right. So, in the last part, maybe we'll talk a bit about what prevention would require, right? How do we treat online threats, cyber stalking, non-consensual disclosure of of personal information as early indicators of possible physical harm? That's one thing that we've discussed. Um, but we've also seen, for example, in Pakistan, when it comes to technology facilitated gender-based violence, on we have the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act, PICA, right? But it does not have any section that deals with threats. It only deals with, when a crime has been committed, when a picture has been leaked, when a certain type of speech, which is of course political, is of course punishable. But if there are threats of rape, if there are threats of any other action like leaking of personal information, non-consensual intimate imagery, that is not covered by the law. So I think that is one thing. But then the pattern of cyber stalking, something that we've also discussed, is and threatening of people is not a crime, right? What we've
Yeah.
also seen is that coordination between platforms, between the police, between investigation agencies, women's protection services, are of course not up to the mark. And what we're also seeing is that preserving digital evidence, escalating credible threats online, systems for those are also weak. And you rightly pointed out that it's also the systems that are biased against women. So if you are to go and file a complaint, who's processing it, who's listening to the woman, and what the mindset there is. We've seen how a Supreme Court judge commented in Noor Mukadam's case about, essentially character assassination of the victim. So when it comes to this, we also see a lack of representation of women in decision-making roles. So how many
Yes.
women judges are there? How many women lawyers are able to, survive the legal system? And how many women leaders do we see in positions of power where these decisions are made? How many women do we see in the bureaucracy? But do you see the presence of women in decision-making roles as making a difference? Or
I don't know. Yesterday, we actually met with a number of parliamentarians that from the Women's Caucus, like the family met with them. And so many of them, I mean, if not all of them, they are also expressed exhaustion over these, just the hatred of women. But I think that judges or this and that, I mean, we'd have to be specific. I can only speak in generics, and I wouldn't even just narrow it down to Pakistan. Unfortunately, the empathy for women, the like, sorry, I'm not even not wording this correctly, but like the absence of bias is something that we cannot guarantee. And unfortunately, when you live in a patriarchy, even women are not immune. And even you'll see in the comments about a quote unquote TikToker, you'll see about Hina Javed or others. A lot of them are coming from women too. And a lot of these women are professionals and they're doctors and they're teachers and they're professors and stuff. And the misogyny exists in them. And so I do want more and more judges and lawyers and doctors and medical examiners. I mean, the whole system needs an
mm,
influx of people who come in and genuinely believe women are human beings, and that will help. I think, when we talk about misogyny, and I'll bluntly say that people hate women. People want to fight with me on that because it just sounds so extreme. What do you mean we hate women? Like, I love my mom, I love my sister, and this and that. But when you truly, when I say hate women, I even sometimes mean you disregard women. You don't, and for a lot of women to reach the rank of, say, a judge or a senior advocate or, the head of whatever at their hospital, the drudgery that they've had to climb to get up there means they don't maybe even have patience for you saying, by the way, I don't like this. Um, I think particularly we saw after Me Too when younger women, and by younger at that time, I'm meaning millennial and Gen Z. Millennials are now, early 40s, but we're talking about harassment and this and that. You had so many older women being like, shut up. Like, we suffered, we went through it. Why can't you just shut up and take it? And if those are the people populating in our hypothetical scenario, these roles, like that's something to be concerned about. Yes, I think the more would be better. But I think that we are contending with the type of cultural bias in which, earlier I don't know if you said we talk about it at the end, so you can tell me to shut up if I'm going too far off. But talking about red flags and stuff, our culture presents a lot of early domestic abuse signs as like protection, flirting, cutesy. So, I mean, that's what we're contending with, that we have romanticized abuse.
Right. And no, you're absolutely right because it's, like you said, the bias exists whether you're a man or a woman. And to a very large extent, it is absolutely structural, right? So it's embedded within the system. And undoing that or redoing that is, of course, going to be a radical effort rather
Yeah.
than plugging in just more women in the system, of course, which you said would make a difference. But at the same time, that's not the entire issue. Um, is there anything else you would like to mention or talk about that we may have missed?
I think I would want to say that, like, they want to scare us off the internet, particularly girls and women. I got a message yesterday from a woman that like stopped me in my tracks, and she said she's been following me on Twitter since she was a teenager. And because I came online, and if you don't know who I am, like what I do is I tell the patriarchy I'm going to light it on fire. She told me she started doing it and her friends started doing it. And and that was, so I guess what I'm trying to say is like, yes, the internet is not the safest place for women, but like, please don't stop. Like, don't stop using your voice. Don't stop using any platform. Platform is so incredibly powerful. And this is maybe one of the only spaces in Pakistan that women from around the whole country, and I'm talking from wherever we have network, have been able to find and build community with one another and, things like that. So, like, please don't let these nasty nothings spook you off the internet. Like, it is yours for the taking, and like, you need to be heard.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for joining us, Sabah, and
Thank
for
you for
sharing
having
a lot of
me.
your work. And thank you for your work. And, very sorry about what your family is going through, what you're going through, and especially because of, the digital, the sort of, I would call it backlash also, right? The victim blaming. It's, of course, not easy for a family to go through. But yeah, just to sum up the conversation, what we've essentially discussed is that the platforms also need to take this issue very seriously of online misogyny because it's not just comments, it could also have very real life consequences, even death, as we've seen in many cases. And what we've also seen is that this amplification of misogyny by platforms also needs to be addressed. But on a societal level, we need to do better of holding men accountable for their actions towards women, whether it's online or offline. And the narratives that we see around murder of women needs to be empathetic, but also needs to be constructive, where you address where the issues lie, and that lie with how men are given impunity throughout their life. Young boys are never taught how to be respectful, but only young girls are taught how to protect themselves for boys that are disrespectful. And that's where a lot of the energies need to go. as a prevention tactic and strategy. So of course, it starts with your schools, it starts with the home, it starts with the examples of men that young boys see in the media or around them. But at the end, the legal system also needs to be more responsive about what happens online, right? So if there are threats, if there's doxing, if there's, online stalking, that needs to be taken seriously because that will have consequences. So thank you for joining us. That's it from us today. I'm your host, Osama Khilji, and we'll be back with another episode of DigiPod next week.